Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are doing a small 10-minute video on everything you need to know about pawns, pawn structures, and tips to play with your pawns. And this is just the basics, but I think for many people it can help understand the importance of pawns. Now, as our first position and introduction, we're looking at this position. So if we first count the pawns, we have 6 on the black side and 8 on the white side. This means that a 2-pawn advantage in a king and king endgame should be completely winning for white, but the engine is just giving this position zeros. Now, why is this? This is because white has a lot of double pawns. And what double pawns mean, they're usually bad for the person who's playing with the double pawns, and they can usually be played against a double pawn. So the double pawns, they occupy a single file. So they basically count as 1 pawn, and they take off the squares as 1 pawn, but they are doubled. This makes them easy targets. So as a first rule, you want to avoid creating double pawns. There are some cases where creating a double G pawn to open up the H file or a double B pawn to open up the A file is considered good. But in this case, having too many double pawns, like white has 4 double pawns, is considered very bad. And they can be taken advantage of as the black king can sneak a pawn onto e5, c5, and eat up the pawns because the pawns cannot support each other. Now, another thing about this position that is quite interesting is the notion of pawn islands. Pawn islands are basically isolated pawn strings or pawn chains. So if we count the number of pawn islands that black has, if I just turn the board, black has 2 pawn islands. A pawn island that goes from H to F, and a pawn island that goes from C to A. White has 4 pawn islands. Generally speaking, if the less pawn islands you have, the easier it is to play, the easier it is to defend the pawns, and in theory, the better your position or structure should be. So you always want to be the side with less pawn islands. Now, we're going to look at the third concept. The third concept is backwards pawns. So in this case, if I make a move like this, we can see, I'll ask a question, where are black's backwards pawns? So okay, black's backwards pawns are G and C pawns. Now, why are they backwards pawns? Backwards pawns are pawns that cannot be defended by another pawn. These pawns, backwards pawns, are generally targets. They're easy targets for pieces. It is common for rooks to get into the 7th rank or the 2nd rank, and queens to target the backwards pawns. Also, when you have bishop endgames, it is common for bishops to slide into the back rank and target the backwards pawns. Backwards pawns are pawns that cannot support themselves, and it is important to identify the backwards pawns that you have and your opponent has. If you identify them, you can build up pressure against backwards pawns and therefore eventually create 2 weaknesses and maybe win one of the backwards pawns. Basically, you want to always keep in mind which backwards pawns you have and which backwards pawns your opponent has. Furthermore, in this case, white has 4 backwards pawns. So if, for example, black had a rook, then black would aim to slide the rook to f3, h3, d3, and b3, taking advantage of the backwards pawns or the pawns that cannot defend themselves. Now we're looking at isolated pawns. What are isolated pawns? Isolated pawns are pawns that do not have defenders or they are an open file. So in this case, the d4 pawn is isolated. There is no c pawn and there's no e pawn. Therefore, this pawn is the only pawn. Sometimes black also has a pawn here. They are both called isolated pawns. Now, the best way to blockade an isolated pawn or a passed pawn is by using a knight. So in this case, you would want to put your knight in front of the pawn, preventing the movement. And why is blockading with a knight such a good idea? Because if, let's say, your knight gets attacked, you can go to f6 or b6, and if the pawn ever moves, you have another piece that is attacking the pawn. Therefore, it's always best to blockade the isolated pawns with a knight. Now, how do you play against the isolated pawn? Usually, you want to blockade it with a knight, and then you want to build pressure against the isolated pawn with the queen, the bishop. Sometimes you can stack up the rooks on the battery, make a battery against the isolated pawn. And eventually, you try to build up as much pressure So then you can either induce a second weakness in your opponent's position or win the isolated pawn. Now, if you're playing white in this case, and you have an isolated pawn, your goal is either to trade off the pawn as fast as possible, let's say this pawn for this pawn, and then you've lost your weakness, or you want to promote this pawn. But it is important not to push this pawn too far, as then it could become an easy target. Next, we're looking at pawn structures. In this case, you can observe that the number of pawns is equal. Both players have 5 pawns. If I just highlight them all. But there's a 2-on-1 here, and a 4 on 3 here. Now, if I told you which side is better, actually white is better in this case. And this is because this is a 2-on-1. This is like a bit like mathematics. In this case, you can subtract 2 from 1 to just get 1. This means that eventually, let's say move like this. This is going to simplify 1-on-1, and this pawn is going to become a passed pawn. Now, it is important to keep in mind that it's much easier to play a 2-on-1 than a 4-on-3. It is much easier to convert, like to make the passer or the passed pawn when you have 2-on-1 than when you have a 3-on-2 or a 4-on-3 or a 5-on-4, etc. So basically, in this case, you want to identify that, okay, this can simplify to being a passed pawn either on the G file or on the H file, and it is much easier to create a passed pawn here on the G and H files than here between the A and D files. Thank you for watching. That was a very quick brief on pawns for everyone who wanted to save time and actually, pick up some tips to improve their game. If you want me to explain or dive deeper, stay tuned, and hopefully you've enjoyed it and you can drop a follow.